The mountain man's declaration echoed through the valley like thunder, promising a child to the girl society had cast aside. His words carried the weight of ancient tradition, yet the modern world would soon clash with his primitive desire. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The people of Ashfern Ridge called her the Frey. 16-year-old Mary Johnson had heard that name whispered behind hands since she was 9, each syllable weighing her down like another stone in her pockets. The cruel nickname followed her through the dusty streets, clung to her in the general store, and echoed in the church pews where she sat alone, separated from her mother by the imposing figure of Pastor Robert Smith. Mary bore the label with silent resignation, especially after her father disappeared in the snows of 22. The search parties had given up after 3 days, and the town's sympathy had lasted barely a week longer. Within 6 months, her mother had remarried the pastor, a man whose cold eyes judged every morsel that passed Mary's lips. "The Lord provides for the humble, not the indulgent," Pastor Smith would mutter during family meals, his gaze fixed somewhere above her head. He never looked directly at Mary when speaking of her appetite, as if her hunger was too shameful to acknowledge properly. The Johnson family farm was fading, its soil tired and thin after years of poor harvests. The once proud homestead her grandfather had built now sagged at the corners, paint peeling like old scabs. Her stepfather never missed an opportunity to remind Mary that their struggles were somehow connected to her presence. "God wouldn't bless a glutton," he'd say after another failed crop, his voice soft but cutting. "The land knows, child. It always knows." Mary would nod, swallowing both his words and her own hunger, learning to make herself smaller in all the ways that mattered, except the one that earned her the town's scorn. When the annual harvest binding arrived, a ritual older than the town itself, where eligible girls were paired with landowners to secure next year's abundance, no one expected Mary to participate, let alone be chosen. The ceremony was meant for daughters who brought honor to their families, not burdens who drained their resources. The townsfolk gathered in the central clearing, families arranged by status, with Pastor Smith and his new wife standing prominently near the front. Mary lingered at the edges, watching as one by one, girls were selected by farmers with good prospects and strong bloodlines. Then a hush fell over the crowd as Michael Brown emerged from the tree line. The mountain man was rarely seen in town, his solitary cabin high on the ridge surrounded by wild ivy and ancient stone circles. Unlike the failing farms below, his land was rumored to never falter, no matter the drought, rot, or famine. Michael moved through the parting crowd, his weathered face unreadable beneath his battered hat. He stopped, raised a calloused hand, and pointed directly at Mary Johnson. "Her," he said simply, his voice carrying across the sudden silence. "By next harvest, she will bear our son." Michael Brown touched the brim of his battered hat, his weathered fingers lingering on the worn edge, as he surveyed the gathered crowd. The harvest field fell silent as he pointed directly at Mary Johnson, his voice carrying across the stunned onlookers. "By next harvest, she will bear our son," he declared. The words cracked through the hush like thunder, splitting the afternoon air. Every face in the field turned toward Mary, expressions ranging from disbelief to cruel amusement. Someone at the back of the crowd laughed nervously, the sound dying quickly when no one joined in. Michael's eyes, deep-set and unwavering, never left her face. Mary held her cheeks burn as whispers rippled through the townsfolk. Pastor Robert Smith, her stepfather, stood rigid beside her mother, his jaw clenched in what might have been anger or relief. Perhaps both. Being chosen meant one less mouth to feed in his household, yet being selected by the mountain man carried implications that surely troubled his pious sensibilities. As the merciless sun beat down on the gathering, Mary's world shifted beneath her feet. The ground seemed to tilt, and she steadied herself against a nearby post. Was this a punishment or a rescue? The question echoed in her mind as she struggled to process what had just happened. The mountain man lived alone on the ridge above town, his cabin perched among wild ivy and ancient stone circles that predated the settlement itself. Everyone knew the stories. While other farms withered during hard times, the land around his dwelling never failed. Not during the worst drought, not when rot claimed other crops, not even during the great famine 3 winters past. "The earth favors him," an old woman whispered nearby, her voice carrying just enough for Mary to hear. Some say he's been here since before our grandfathers. The townsfolk traded their theories as they always did, that Michael never aged, that he drank root blood from the mountain springs, that he knew words that could bend the very soil to his will. Mary had heard these tales her entire life, but never imagined she would become part of them. As the harvest binding ceremony concluded, people drifted away in small groups, casting backward glances at the girl they called the Freight, and the solitary figure who had claimed her. Michael approached her with measured steps, nodding once before speaking in a voice meant only for her ears. "Pack what matters. I'll come for you at first light." With that he turned and walked away, leaving Mary standing alone in the trampled field, the weight of her new future pressing down heavier than any burden she had carried before. Dawn broke with a chill that seeped through Mary Johnson's threadbare dress as she stood outside her mother's farmhouse. No tearful goodbyes awaited her. Mrs. Johnson remained inside, her silhouette briefly visible through the curtains before disappearing altogether. Pastor Smith was nowhere to be seen, though Mary suspected he was watching from somewhere, perhaps relieved to be rid of his unwanted stepdaughter. Michael Brown waited at the edge of the property, his tall figure silhouetted against the morning light. He carried no wagon, brought no horse, just himself and the mountain looming behind him. The mountain man nodded once, indicating it was time to leave. "I'm ready," Mary whispered, though no one had asked. She clutched her burlap bag containing the few possessions she owned, a wooden comb, the spare dress, and a small cloth doll her father had made before disappearing in the winter of '22. The path up the ridge grew steeper with each turn. Mary struggled to keep pace with Michael, her breath coming in short gasps. The sweat trickled down her back despite the morning chill. The mountain man never slowed, never looked back, yet somehow seemed aware of her presence, pausing momentarily at particularly difficult stretches before continuing onward. As they climbed higher, the air changed. Mary noticed it first in her lungs. Each breath felt fuller, richer somehow. The scent of sage and wild herbs grew stronger, mingling with the earthy aroma of soil that seemed more alive than the tired dirt of her family's failing farm below. Questions burned in her throat. Why had he chosen her? What did he expect? Was she truly meant to bear a child, as he had so boldly announced at the harvest binding? But the silence between them felt impenetrable, and Mary kept her wonderings locked behind pressed lips. By midday they reached a clearing where a cabin stood, weathered but sturdy, with smoke curling from its stone chimney. Behind it, ancient stone circles peeked through tall grasses, their purpose unknown to her. Michael stopped at the threshold, his weathered face unreadable. He gestured toward the open door with a calloused hand. No welcome speech, no explanation of what her life would be now. Just a simple nod toward the entrance. "Eat only what grows from the mountain," he said, his voice low and gravelly from disuse. "The land will teach you what you need to know." Mary stepped inside, her heart hammering against her ribs. The cabin was simple but clean, with dried herbs hanging from rafters and a small fire crackling in the hearth. This was her home now, for better or worse. The mountain had claimed her, and she had no choice but to surrender to its mysteries. Mary Johnson spent her first nights in the cabin with her heart hammering against her ribs. The wooden structure creaked and moaned with every gust of wind, its aged planks allowing thin streams of moonlight to paint silvery lines across the floor. Worse than the sounds of the settling cabin were the unexplained footsteps that sometimes circled the perimeter after midnight, too heavy to be animal, too rhythmic to be branches. Michael Brown kept his distance, neither hovering nor explaining. He'd leave before dawn and return with bundles of herbs or soil samples, acknowledging her with brief nods before retreating to his own corner of the small dwelling. The mountain man offered no comfort, but neither did he make demand. This strange freedom, this unspoken permission to simply exist, left Mary adrift in uncertainty. "You can gather eggs from the coop out back," he told her on the third morning, the most words he'd strung together since their arrival. "The mountain provides what we need." By the end of the first week, Mary noticed something peculiar. The gnawing hunger that had been her constant companion, the craving that Pastor Smith had condemned as gluttony, began to fade. At first, she worried she might be falling ill, but instead of weakness, she felt a growing vitality coursing through her veins. "Drink this," Michael said one evening, offering a steaming cup of bitter tea made from roots she couldn't identify. The ridge wants you strong. She drank without question, surprised by her own compliance. The liquid warmed her from within, spreading through her limbs like liquid sunlight. That night, she slept without dreams for the first time since her father disappeared. As days turned to weeks, Mary found herself changing. Her skin, once troubled with blemishes that her stepfather claimed were marks of sin, cleared to a healthy glow. The perpetual ache in her lower back from years of being told to make herself smaller, to hunch and hide, eased as she unconsciously began to stand taller. Most remarkable was how food lost its emotional hold. She ate the simple meals of foraged greens, eggs, and occasional game that Michael prepared, but the desperate emptiness that had driven her to secret midnight pantry raids in her mother's house was gone. It was as if the mountain itself sustained her through some invisible connection. "The land knows what you need," her host remarked one evening, watching her with those ancient eyes, "better than you do sometimes." Mary nodded, realizing with quiet surprise that for the first time in her life, she felt at home. Not because of comfort or luxury, but because here on this wild ridge above Ashfern Ridge, she wasn't the freight anymore. She was simply herself, and somehow that was enough. The morning mist clung to the ridge as Michael Brown beckoned Mary toward the eastern slope. His weathered hands moved with purpose, pulling back layers of decaying leaves to reveal the dark soil beneath. "This is where it begins," he said, his voice low and steady. "Everything we are comes from what lies beneath our feet." Mary watched skeptically as he pressed his palm against the earth, eyes closed in concentration. The mountain man had been teaching her for weeks now, each lesson more peculiar than the last. Sometimes they would sit in silence for hours just listening to the wind. Other times he would have her identify plants blindfolded, using only her sense of smell. "The moon pulls at more than just the tides," Michael explained, gesturing toward the waning crescent barely visible in the morning sky. "It tugs at the sap in trees, the moisture in soil, the blood in our veins. To know when to plant, you must first know how to listen." Mary nodded, though inwardly she rolled her eyes. His teachings were always like this. Half practical knowledge, half mystical nonsense that made no sense to her. When she asked direct questions about why he had chosen her at the harvest binding, he would only respond with riddles. "Bearing the future of the mountain means becoming part of it," he told her one evening as they collected herbs by twilight. The phrase hung between them like smoke, neither explanation nor comfort. "What does that even mean?" Mary finally snapped, her patience wearing thin. "You speak as if I'm supposed to understand, but you explain nothing." Michael simply smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening. "Understanding comes through the body first, then the mind. The mountain doesn't speak in words." Despite her frustration, Mary found herself absorbing his lessons. Her hands began to recognize which soil would nurture seeds and which would suffocate them. She learned to predict rain by the behavior of insects and the scent in the air. Her body was changing too, not becoming thinner as Pastor Smith had always insisted she should, but stronger, more connected to the rhythm of the ridge. At night, lying on her pallet in the corner of Michael's cabin, Mary would hear strange sounds carried on the wind. Sometimes it was like chanting, other times like drums beating in perfect time with her heart. She never mentioned these sounds to Michael, afraid he would think her mad, but something told her he heard them too. The mountain was alive beneath her, breathing, listening, waiting, and somehow, impossibly, it was changing her. Mary could feel it in her dreams, in the way plants seemed to lean toward her as she passed, in how animals no longer startled at her approach. The ridge was waking something inside her that had always been there, dormant and patient, and though she would never admit it aloud, Mary was beginning to listen back. The night air carried whispers Mary couldn't ignore. A distant glow beckoned through the trees, pulling her from the cabin's safety into the moonlit forest. She followed the flicker of firelight, her bare feet finding the path as if guided by some ancient memory. The scent of burning sage and pine grew stronger with each step, mingling with rhythmic sounds that seemed to pulse from the earth itself. When Mary Johnson reached the clearing, she froze. A circle of women danced on a flat expanse of stone, their shadows stretching like giants against the surrounding trees. Their bodies, some slender as saplings, others robust and powerful, moved in perfect harmony with drums, she couldn't see. Unlike the cruel whispers of townsfolk who had mocked her size, here the women's different forms were celebrated, each one flowing with a grace that belonged to the mountain itself. Mary stood transfixed, half hidden behind an ancient oak. These weren't townswomen she recognized. They wore simple garments adorned with symbols she'd glimpsed in Michael's cabin: spirals, moons and patterns that mimicked root systems beneath the soil. One woman, her silver hair catching the firelight, turned suddenly toward Mary's hiding place. Without breaking her dance, she extended her arm in invitation, palm open. The circle parted like water, creating a path to its center. Mary hesitated. Pastor Smith's warnings about pagan rituals echoed in her mind, his sermons condemning women who danced with the devil, yet something deeper than fear pulled her forward. Her first step onto the stone sent a vibration through her body, as if the mountain recognized her weight. The women's movements slowed as Mary entered their circle. No judgment crossed their faces, only welcome. For the first time since her father disappeared in the snows, Mary felt something unfamiliar bloom in her chest: belonging. As the dance resumed, Mary's body remembered steps she'd never learned. Her size, once a burden to be hidden, became power as she moved with the others, her feet connecting with ancient stone that seemed to pulse beneath them. Then, amid the swirling forms, a face emerged that stopped Mary's heart. Weathered by years but unmistakable, her grandmother, who had vanished when Mary was 7, presumed dead after wandering into winter woods. The older woman's eyes held the same warmth Mary remembered, though now they carried something deeper: knowledge that transcended the ordinary world. As they danced past one another, her grandmother leaned close, her breath warm against Mary's ear. "He's not who you think," she whispered, her voice blending with the night wind. "But neither are you." Before Mary could respond, the woman spun away, becoming one with the circle again. The fire leapt higher, casting all their faces in golden light, and Mary danced until dawn broke over the ridge, questions burning in her mind like embers. When dawn broke, Mary Johnson found Michael tending to the garden, as if the previous night had never happened. He nodded toward a patch of herbs that needed tending, his face betraying nothing of the mysterious gathering she had witnessed. But Mary couldn't focus on the soil beneath her fingers. Her grandmother's words, "He's not who you but neither are you," echoed in her mind like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing. As she worked, Mary stole glances at the mountain man. Was this arrangement truly about bearing his child, as he had so boldly announced at the harvest binding, or was there something deeper at play, something ancient that ran through the very roots of Ash Fern Ridge itself? The women, she finally ventured, her voice barely above a whisper. They spoke of inheritance. Michael paused, dirt-covered hands suspended in mid-air. "The mountain chooses its own," he replied cryptically, then returned to his work. By midday, a cold wind swept down from the summit, carrying with it the first kiss of frost. Mary wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Something was coming. She could sense it in the way the birds had fallen silent, in the way the soil seemed to tremble beneath her feet. Her instincts proved correct when, as afternoon shadows lengthened across the ridge, the sound of approaching wagons broke the mountain's peace. Leading the procession was Pastor Robert Smith, his black coat flapping like crow wings as he marched toward the cabin. Behind him trudged several members of the town council, their faces set in grim determination. "We've come for the girl," her stepfather announced, not bothering with pleasantries. His cold eyes, which had judged every morsel Mary had ever eaten, now burned with righteous indignation. "This unholy arrangement ends today." The councilmen murmured in agreement, their wagons loaded with supplies, clearly prepared to stay until their demands were met. One man spat on the ground, muttering about pagan practices and unnatural union. Mary felt herself shrinking under their collective gaze, years of shame rushing back. But then she felt it, a subtle vibration through the soles of her feet, as if the mountain itself was steadying her. Michael stepped forward, surprisingly calm in the face of their hostility. "The girl stays," he said simply. "She belongs to the ridge now." Pastor Smith's face reddened. "She belongs to her family and to God, not to some mountain hermit with his heathen way." As the confrontation escalated, Mary realized with startling clarity that these men weren't just fighting for her return, they were fighting against something they feared, something that threatened the very foundation of their control over Ashfern Ridge. And somehow, inexplicably, she stood at the center of it all. Michael Brown did not resist the town council's demands. With a composure that seemed etched from the ancient stones themselves, he invited Pastor Robert Smith and his men to stay through the full moon. "The mountain welcomes all who come with honest hearts," he said, his voice as calm as winter ice. The pastor hesitated, his stern face betraying uncertainty, but pride kept him from retreating. That evening, the men from town made camp in the clearing near Michael's cabin. They built a fire that cast long shadows against the trees, their nervous laughter cutting through the unusual stillness of the night. Mary watched from the cabin window as the mountain air thickened around them. "They don't understand what they've stepped into," Michael whispered beside her, his weathered hand resting on the windowsill. "But by morning they will." As darkness deepened, Mary noticed strange patterns forming in the shadows. The mountain seemed to breathe beneath them, a slow, ancient rhythm that made the flames dance in unnatural ways. The men grew quiet, their conversations dying as each became lost in private visions that played across their faces. Mary crept outside, drawn by an inexplicable pull. The air hummed with energy she could almost taste. She watched as one by one, the men's expressions shifted from confusion to wonder, then to fear. Some wept silently, others stared transfixed at nothing visible to Mary's eye. Pastor Smith sat apart from the others, his Bible clutched to his chest, lips moving in desperate prayer. Unlike the others, his eyes remained wide open, fixed on something in the distance that made his body tremble. By dawn, Mary awoke to find the clearing empty save for her stepfather. The other men had vanished without taking their belongings, leaving only footprints in the dew-soaked earth. The mountain stood silent, revealing nothing of the night's mysteries. Robert Smith stumbled to his feet when he saw her, his once judgmental eyes now filled with a wild reverence. "The mountain showed me," he whispered, reaching toward Mary with shaking hands. "I saw what you will become." He refused to explain more, gathering his few possessions with trembling fingers. Before departing down the trail, he turned to Mary once more. "Forgiveness," he murmured, "I ask for yours." Within days, word spread through Ashfern Ridge. The preacher who had once condemned Mary as a burden now spoke of her with awe, claiming a miracle was growing within her, not just a child, but a blessing that would save them all. The town's mockery transformed into fascination, their fear into desperate hope. Mary watched this change with unease, knowing that whatever the mountain had shown her stepfather wasn't the simple truth, but perhaps a truth he could understand. The mountain spoke differently to each person, and Robert Smith had heard what he needed to hear. The whispers changed overnight. Mary Johnson, once mocked as the Freight, now heard a new name trailing her like autumn leaves, the Mother of Plenty. The transformation in how the townspeople regarded her was jarring. Mothers with hungry children would approach her in the dirt paths, touching her sleeve with reverence, asking when the blessing would come. Older men removed their hats as she passed, their weathered faces a mixture of hope and distrust. "When will the mountain's bounty flow through you to us?" they would ask, their eyes never quite meeting hers. Mary felt the weight of their expectations pressing against her chest. This wasn't right. The awe in their voices carried something hollow, something that made her skin prickle with unease. They didn't see her, they saw what Pastor Smith had told them to see, a vessel, a conduit for miracle and abundance. Meanwhile, Michael grew more distant with each passing day. He would rise before dawn and walk to the eastern edge of the ridge, standing motionless for hours, his gaze fixed on the horizon, as if waiting for something only he could perceive. When Mary approached him once, his eyes seemed cloud unfocused. "The soil speaks differently now," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "It's preparing." The mountain itself seemed to be shifting beneath them. The earth around the cabin felt warm to the touch, even on cool mornings. Small animals, rabbits, foxes, even the cautious deer behaved erratically, sometimes approaching the cabin to stare at Mary before darting away. Birds circled in unusual patterns overhead, their formations spelling secrets in the sky. Most unsettling were the changes Mary observed in the women's circle. They gathered more frequently now, their movements urgent and purposeful. Her grandmother would return from these meetings with dirt under her fingernails and a distant look in her eyes. The women were preparing a chamber near the summit, an ancient ring of stones that Mary had passed but never entered. "What are you building up there?" Mary asked one evening as her grandmother combed her hair by firelight. The older woman's hands paused briefly. "Not building, child. Awakening. What sleeps must rise." Mary watched as they carried bundles of herbs and small pouches of soil up the path to the summit. Sometimes at night she would wake to the sound of chanting carried on the wind, the words just beyond her understanding yet somehow familiar, as if they were words her body knew but her mind had forgotten. The mountain was preparing for something, and Mary stood at its center, uncertain whether she was its chosen one or its sacrifice. Mary sat cross-legged on the cool stone floor as the women of the circle gathered around her. Their faces, illuminated by flickering lantern light, revealed nothing but expectation. One of them, a woman with silver-streaked hair, leaned forward and whispered, "When blood touches root, the land awakens." The cryptic phrase hung in the air like morning mist. Mary Johnson pressed her palms against the rough stone, feeling the mountain's pulse beneath her fingers. "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice stronger than it had been months ago when she first arrived. The women exchanged glances but offered no clarification. Instead, they continued their preparations, grinding herbs and arranging small bundles of dried plants in patterns Mary couldn't decipher. Their silence frustrated her, but she'd learned patience since coming to the ridge. Later that night, as moonlight spilled through the cabin window, Mary's grandmother appeared like a shadow, brush in hand. The older woman, whom everyone had believed dead for years, began stroking Mary's hair with gentle, rhythmic movements. "They won't tell me what's happening," Mary whispered, leaning into her grandmother's touch. "Everyone speaks in riddles about blood and roots and bearing sons." Her grandmother's hands paused briefly. "It's not about childbirth, child," she murmured, her voice soft as falling leaves. "It's about inheritance." The brush resumed its gentle strokes, but Mary's mind raced. Inheritance? What could Michael possibly have that— "Not his possessions," her grandmother interrupted. "His connection, his bond with the mountain itself." Understanding crashed into Mary like a landslide. The pieces suddenly aligned: Michael's cryptic teachings about becoming part of the mountain, the women's preparations, the way the land responded to her touch. She wasn't chosen to bear Michael Brown's child in the literal sense. She was chosen to inherit his role, to become the next steward of the mountain. "The harvest binding," Mary whispered, realization dawning. "It was never about marriage or children." Her grandmother nodded. "It's an old metaphor, from times when people understood that land needs tending like a child needs raising." Mary stood abruptly, her heart pounding. The weight that had defined her for so long suddenly felt different. Not a burden, but a strength. The mountain had chosen her not despite who she was, but because of it. "This legacy," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I can refuse it." Her grandmother's eyes reflected the moonlight. "You can, but the mountain has already begun to claim you just as you've begun to claim it." Mary turned toward the window, gazing at the dark silhouette of the ridge against the night sky. The legacy was hers to claim or refuse, and for the first time in her life, the choice was truly her own. The truth crashed into Mary Johnson like a landslide. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she fled down the mounting path, each footfall sending shards of frozen ether flying. The winter air burned her lungs, but she couldn't stop. She had to escape what the women's circle had revealed, that she wasn't meant to bear a child, but to inherit an ancient power. Her boots cracked through ice-crusted puddles as she stumbled downward, the moon casting long shadows across her path. Tears froze on her cheeks before they could fall. The mountain seemed to reach for her with gnarled branches and shifting stones, but Mary pressed on, desperate to return to something familiar, something safe. By midnight she reached the edge of town, its windows glowing with lamplight. Mary staggered to her mother's house, the place that had never truly been home since Pastor Smith arrived, but the only refuge she could imagine. Her knuckles were raw as she pounded on the door. "Mother, please," she begged, her voice breaking. "Let me." Through the thin curtains, she saw Mrs. Johnson's silhouette approach the door. For one hopeful moment, Mary thought she would find sanctuary. Then she heard the bolt slide firmly into place. "Go back to the mountain," her mother whispered through the wood, fear threading through every word. "I can't stand against what's chosen you." Mary pressed her forehead against the cold door, understanding with brutal clarity that her mother's fear of the mountain and perhaps of Pastor Smith was greater than her love. The rejection cut deeper than the winter chill. As she turned away, Mary felt dozens of eyes on her. The townsfolk peered from behind curtains and through cracked doors, watching her. Some faces showed pity, most reflected fear, but none offered help. These were the same people who had called her the Freight for years, who had laughed when Michael Brown chose her at the harvest binding. Now they watched her with a new kind of wariness, the kind reserved for things not fully understood. A child's face appeared in one window, curious rather than frightened, but was quickly pulled away by adult hands. Standing alone in the center of town, Mary wrapped her arms around herself. The realization settled over her like fresh snow. She no longer belonged here. Perhaps she never had. The only place that had ever truly accepted her was the wild ridge above, with its ancient stones and whispering winds. The mountain waited for her decision, and despite her fear, despite her resistance to the path laid before her, Mary knew she would climb back up. Not because she had no choice, but because for the first time in her life, she might have a real one. The frost melted away as spring breathed life back into Ashfern Ridge. Mary Johnson found herself drawn back to the mountain, not out of belief in ancient traditions or mysterious prophecies, but because questions burned inside her like embers refusing to die. The town below had offered her no refuge, only closed doors and fearful glances. As she ascended the familiar path, wildflowers pushed through the thawing earth, their persistence mirroring her own. The mountain air felt different now, cleaner, sharper, as if it recognized her return. When she reached Michael's cabin, she found him kneeling in the soil, tending to delicate green shoots. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he worked, a vulnerability she'd never noticed before. "You came back," he said without looking up, his voice carrying neither surprise nor judgment. Mary stood her ground, watching him. The mountain man seemed smaller somehow, less mysterious now that she'd glimpsed the truth behind the ritual that had brought her here. "I need to understand," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. Michael finally rose, wiping soil from his palms. The silence between them stretched taut until Mary couldn't bear it any longer. "You lied to me," she accused, the words bursting forth like water through a broken dam. "All that talk about bearing your son, it was never about a child at all, was it?" He met her gaze then, his eyes ancient pools of sadness and knowledge. The lines on his face seemed deeper in the spring light, mapping a lifetime she couldn't begin to comprehend. "I named your future because you couldn't see it yet," Michael replied softly. "That wasn't cruelty. That was hope." His words hung in the clearing, simple yet profound. Mary felt something shift inside her, like soil after rain. "The mountain chose you long before I did," he continued, gesturing to the land around them. "I merely recognized what was already written." A pair of birds darted overhead, their wings catching sunlight. Mary watched them, considering his words. The women's circle, her grandmother's whispers, the way the earth seemed to respond to her touch, it all began to align in her mind like stars forming a constellation. "So what happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Michael's lips curved into the ghost of a smile. "That's for you to decide. The mountain offers possibilities, not certainties." For the first time since being chosen at the harvest binding, Mary felt the weight of expectation lift from her shoulders. The future wasn't predetermined by Michael's announcement, or the town's judgment, or even the mountain's ancient power. It was hers to shape, to accept or reject, to transform into something entirely new. She looked at the soil beneath her feet, feeling its potential vibrating through her bones. This was not about bearing a child for a man. This was about becoming herself. Mary Johnson stood at the edge of the stone circle, her hands planted firmly on her hips. The women gathered there fell silent, their ancient chants dying on their lips as they regarded her with curious eyes. "I won't do it your way," she announced, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "If this mountain has chosen me, then I choose how I serve it." Her grandmother stepped forward, weathered face creased with concern. "Child, these rituals have sustained the ridge for generations, and they'll continue," Mary replied, "but on my terms." The next morning she hiked to a sunny patch near the summit, a place where the soil felt warm beneath her fingers, despite the altitude's chill. She carried a small cloth pouch of tomato seeds, crops the women insisted would never survive so high up the mountain. "Too cold," one had warned. "Too exposed," said another. Mary simply smiled and dug her fingers into the earth. As she planted each seed, she whispered to the soil, not with mystical incantations but with simple promises of care and attention. The mountain seemed to listen, the ground accepting her offerings with a subtle warmth that rose through her knees. Over the following weeks, Mary tended her unconventional garden daily, while Michael Brown grew more distant, spending his days at the far edges of his property. She poured her energy into the small green shoots that defied all expectations by breaking through the soil. "The mountain is testing you," her grandmother observed one evening, watching Mary return with dirt-crusted fingernails and a determined smile. "No," Mary countered. "We're getting to know each other." When the first tomatoes ripened, plump and impossibly red against the grey stone backdrop, Mary gathered the women's circle. She built a fire in the ancient ring of stones and prepared a simple feast from her harvest. The women watched, skeptical at first, then increasingly intrigued as she worked. "This is my ritual," she explained, slicing the fruits and releasing their fragrant juice. Growing, nourishing, sharing. As they ate together under the open sky, red juice stained their fingers and palms, blood from the earth, born of Mary's own labor rather than mysterious sacrifice. The women's laughter rose into the evening air, lighter than their solemn chants had ever been. Later, as twilight settled over the ridge, Mary felt a subtle shift in the ground beneath her feet. The mountain's presence seemed to expand around them, not with the threatening rumble she'd felt before, but with something that felt remarkably like approval. One of the older women took Mary's juice-stained hand in her own and nodded slowly. "Different," she acknowledged, "but the mountain hears you all the same." Above them, stars emerged in a clear sky, and for the first time since climbing the ridge, Mary felt truly at home. Mary Johnson noticed the change as summer deepened across Ashfern Ridge. While her tomato vines climbed higher and her herbs flourished with unexpected vigor, Michael Brown's portion of the land told a different story. The corn he had planted yellowed despite adequate rain. His usually faithful goats wandered aimlessly, sometimes appearing at Mary's door as if seeking new leadership. Michael himself seemed to be fading like his crops. His once steady hands now trembled when he worked the soil. The mountain man's eyes, which had once held such certainty, now carried a hollow resignation. Mary watched him struggle to complete tasks that had once been effortless. His breathing labored as he hauled water from the spring. "You should rest," Mary suggested one evening, offering him a cup of tea made from her thriving mint. He accepted it with a nod but wouldn't meet her gaze. "The mountain doesn't allow for rest," he replied, his voice carrying none of the authority it once commanded. "Not during transition." Mary sat beside him on the rough-hewn bench outside his cabin. The sunset painted the valley below in amber light, the town's scattered buildings looking like toys from this height. She had grown comfortable in this place that had once terrified her. "What transition?" she asked, though part of her already understood. Michael set down his cup and turned to face her. In the fading light he looked ancient, as if the years he'd held at bay were suddenly catching up. "The seed is already in you," he said quietly, "and it's pushing me out." A chill ran through Mary despite the summer warmth. The mountain man's words carried a finality that made her stomach tighten. "I don't understand," she said, though she did. "The mountain chooses its keeper," Michael explained, gesturing toward the flourishing plants around her dwelling. "It's been mine for longer than anyone remembers. Now it's reaching for you." That night, Mary lay awake, listening to the mountain's whispers. The wind through the trees seemed to carry voices, confirming what Michael had said. She placed her palm against the cabin wall, feeling a pulse that matched her own heartbeat. The next morning she found a dead sparrow on Michael's doorstep. The day after, his well ran dry while hers overflowed. When his favorite hound refused to return to his cabin, instead curling at Mary's feet, The truth became undeniable. "Can't we both tend the land?" she asked him when they crossed paths near the stone circle. Michael shook his head, resignation etched in every line of his face. "The mountain will not be divided in its loyalty," he said. "It never has been." Mary watched him walk away, his shoulders bent under the weight of the mountain's rejection. The land was choosing, and it would not be denied. Mary Johnson's dreams became increasingly disturbing as the seasons shifted. Night after night she tossed on her straw mattress in Michael's cabin, haunted by visions of destruction. Flames devoured the mountain summit, earth split into jagged wounds, and beneath it all, a mournful wailing, as if the mountain itself cried out in agony. When she woke one dawn to the acrid scent of smoke, her heart nearly stopped. Rushing outside in her nightclothes, Mary discovered the ridge wasn't ablaze with fire but smoking from within, thin tendrils of vapor rising from cracks in the soil, the ground itself exhaling hot, troubled breath. "It's choosing," her grandmother whispered, appearing beside her as if summoned by the mountain's distress. The older woman's weathered face was grave in the early light. "The land cannot sustain two keepers. It's tearing itself apart." Mary understood that the mountain, ancient and powerful, was caught between loyalties: Michael Brown, its longtime steward, and herself, its chosen successor. Like a river forced to flow in two directions, the land was rebelling against this impossible division. That evening she confronted Michael near the stone circle. His once steady frame had grown gaunt, his eyes hollow. The crops around his portion of land withered despite the season, while hers flourished with unnatural vigor. "The mountain is suffering," Mary said, her voice carrying on the wind. "Can't you feel it?" Michael ran his fingers through soil that crumbled too easily. "This land has been mine for longer than you know," he replied, voice cracking with emotion. "Before your grandmother was born, before her grandmother drew breath, I was here." The earth beneath them trembled slightly, as if acknowledging his words. "But it's choosing me now," Mary said, not with pride but with certainty. Michael's jaw tightened. "I cannot simply let go. This mountain is all I am." As darkness fell, more fissures appeared across the ridge. Animals fled downhill in panicked groups, rabbits, foxes, and deer abandoning their homes. The women's circle gathered at the edge of the disturbance, their faces illuminated by the strange glow emanating from the cracks. Mary felt the mountain's pain as her own, a tearing sensation deep in her chest. The land couldn't sustain this division much longer. Something would break catastrophically if balance wasn't restored. Yet Michael refused to relinquish his claim, clinging desperately to the fading threads of his connection. Each morning he performed the old rituals with increasing desperation, his hands trembling as he worked. Each night, the mountain's distress grew more pronounced, the smoking fissures widening, the air growing thick with sulphurous warning. The time for a decision was running out. The mountain would have its keeper, one way or another. Mary Johnson didn't reach for weapons or harsh words as the mountain trembled between two wills. Instead, she sent word through the circle of women, summoning them to witness what she called a binding reversal, not an ancient ritual passed down through generations, but one born from her own understanding of the land. The women arrived at dusk, their faces solemn in the fading light. Among them was Mary's grandmother, her weathered hands steady as she arranged stones in a pattern only she could read. The older woman nodded encouragingly, whispering, "The mountain has always known who you are." As darkness settled over the ridge, Mary stood alone in the center of the stone circle. The ground beneath her feet pulsed with an ancient heartbeat, while Michael Brown watched from the shadows, his once commanding presence now diminished, his connection to the land unraveling thread by thread. "This isn't about taking what's yours," Mary called to him, her voice carrying across the clearing. "It's about becoming what I'm meant to be." She knelt and plunged her hands deep into the soil, feeling the cool earth embrace her fingers. The dirt that had once been whispered about in town, soil that never failed despite drought or blight, seemed to welcome her touch. "I am not your bride," she declared, addressing both Michael and the mountain itself. "I am not the vessel for your son or your legacy as you imagined it." The women formed a circle around her, their breathing synchronized with the wind that swept down from the summit. Mary felt strength flowing from them, not as magic but as solidarity, the same strength that had sustained generations of women who had been overlooked and underestimated. "I am a keeper," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "I offer my labor freely, my sweat, my voice, my understanding. I ask nothing in return but the chance to belong, to serve this land as it serves those who respect it." As she spoke, clouds gathered overhead, dark and heavy with promise. The mountain seemed to listen, its ancient presence focused entirely on the girl who had once been called the Freight, but now stood tall with purpose. "The old ways end tonight," Mary declared. "No more girls bound to men in the name of harvest. No more treating people as property or burdens." The earth beneath her palms trembled, and a low groan echoed through the stones. The sky split open with a crack of thunder that shook the very foundation of the ridge. Rain began to fall, not in angry torrents but in gentle drops that kissed the soil like tears of relief. Pastor Smith, who had been watching from the edge of the clearing, fell to his knees in awe. The mountain was choosing, and its choice was clear. The earth trembled beneath their feet, a low rumble that vibrated through bone and soil alike. The women's circle gasped in unison as the ground beneath Michael Brown began to sink, not violently, but with the slow inevitability of an embrace. The mountain was reclaiming its own. Mary watched, transfixed, as the man who had chosen her at the harvest binding now knelt in a depression that deepened with each passing moment. There was no terror in his weathered face, no struggle against the inevitable. Instead, Michael looked up at her with eyes clear as spring water, a profound peace settling across his features. "Now you are the mountain," he whispered, his voice carrying to her despite the distance between them. The soil rose around his waist, then his chest, enveloping him like a lover. Mary's grandmother reached for her hand, squeezing it tightly as they witnessed the transition of power. This was no punishment, but a completion, the mountain accepting its new steward. As the earth closed over Michael's head, his expression remained serene, almost grateful. The ground sealed itself with barely a seam, wildflowers immediately sprouting where he had stood moments before. The mountain had made its choice. A hush fell over the ridge, so complete that Mary could hear her own heartbeat echoing in her ears. The women stood silent, their faces illuminated by the setting sun, waiting. Even the birds had stopped their evening songs, as if the whole world was holding its breath. Then, the wind. It swept down from the summit carrying Mary's name in a whisper that seemed to come from the stones themselves. It rushed through the trees, down the slopes, into the valleys below where the townspeople would hear it in their dreams tonight. "Mary," it seemed to say. Mary Johnson. The oldest woman in the circle approached her, eyes bright with unshed tears. "The mountain has spoken," she said, her voice cracking with emotion. "It has not chosen so clearly in 7 generations. Mary felt something shift inside her. Not a physical change, but a deepening connection to the soil beneath her feet, to the rocks and roots and hidden streams. She could sense the boundaries of her land now, feel its moods and needs like extensions of her own body. The women formed a circle around the spot where Michael had disappeared, their hands joined in silent acknowledgement of what they had witnessed. No one spoke of loss or grief. This was the way of the mountain, one steward fading as another rose to take their place. As darkness fell, Mary led them back toward the cabin that was now truly hers, knowing that by morning the valleys below would be buzzing with whispers of change. 1 year after the first harvest, Mary Johnson stood at the edge of the stone circle, watching the townspeople gather below. The autumn wind carried the scent of ripened crops and fresh-turned earth. As families climbed the path she had widened herself, stone by stubborn stone, her body had changed, not becoming thin as Pastor Smith had once insisted God demanded, but growing strong and rooted like the mountain itself. Her presence filled the clearing with an authority that needed no apology. The people of Ashfern Ridge approached with cautious reverence, many carrying baskets or small tokens. Mary recognized faces that had once whispered, the Freight behind cupped hands. Now they looked at her with something between fear and hope. "Welcome," she said, her voice carried across the gathering without strain. She wore her weight with power, standing tall in clothes she had sewn herself from fabric dyed with mountain herbs. Pastor Robert Smith stood near the front, his once judgmental eyes now holding a mixture of awe and uncertainty. Beside him, Mary's mother kept her gaze lowered, still unable to meet her daughter's eyes directly. "I've called you here not to speak of miracles," Mary continued, "but of labor." She held up her hands, showing calluses and dirt-lined fingernails. "This is what feeds us. Not prayers alone, not rituals without purpose." She spoke of tilling soil when muscles screamed for rest, of the sting of blisters that hardened into protective skin, of the strength it took to feed others when the world expected you to disappear. As she talked, she led them through her gardens where vegetables grew in spiraling patterns that defied traditional farming rows. "The mountain provides," she explained, "but only when we listen, only when we give." The townspeople listened, hungry for guidance, for hope, and most pressingly for food. The valley farms had struggled again this season, while Mary's mountain plots had flourished. An elderly man stepped forward, hat in weathered hands. "We've come to trade," he said simply. Mary nodded, "and I welcome fair exchange. But understand, what grows here isn't just food for your bodies. It's nourishment for something deeper." She looked at each face, meeting their gazes directly. "Those who wish to learn are welcome to return. Those who wish only to take." She let the sentence hang unfinished in the air. As the trading began, Mary felt the mountain hum beneath her feet, approving, patient, alive. The women's circle moved among the visitors, their presence a reminder that Mary was not alone in her stewardship. This was only the beginning. The autumn light bathed Mary Johnson's garden in hues of amber and gold, casting long shadows across rows of thriving vegetables that defied the mountain's harsh conditions. She stood among the harvest, her strong frame silhouetted against the setting sun, watching as children gathered around her with eager eyes and dirt-stained hands. These weren't just any children, they were the forgotten ones of Ashfern Ridge, orphans whose parents had succumbed to harsh winters, girls deemed too troublesome for proper homes, and young boys who asked too many questions for the town's comfort. "The soil remembers everything," Mary told them, kneeling to scoop a handful of dark earth. "It knows your touch, your patience, your respect." A small girl with tangled hair reached out hesitantly, letting the dirt trickle through her fingers as Mary had shown her. The mountain keeper had begun collecting these lost souls one by one. First came Eliza, found sleeping in an abandoned barn after her father had traded her for a wagon and supplies. Then the Miller twins, whose mother had died in childbirth and whose father couldn't bear to look at them. Each child arrived with hollow eyes and hunched shoulders, carrying the weight of rejection. Mary's grandmother moved among them, her weathered hands guiding small fingers to plant seeds at the proper depth. "Not too deep," she would murmur, "or they'll never find the sun." The women's circle expanded their rituals to include these children. Under moonlight, they taught them songs older than the town itself, melodies that spoke of roots and sky, of belonging to something greater than themselves. The children learned to dance barefoot on stone, feeling the mountain's pulse beneath their toes. "Will we disappear like the mountain man?" asked a boy of 9, his voice barely a whisper. Mary shook her head. "Michael chose his path. You will choose yours." She showed them how to listen to the wind, to read the patterns of birds in flight, to understand when the earth was thirsty or content. What began as survival lessons transformed into something profound. The children stopped flinching at sudden movements. They stood straighter, laughed louder. They argued and reconciled, built shelters and tended fires. They became a family bound not by blood but by the mountain itself. In town, rumors spread about the witches' orphans, but these whispers lacked their former venom. When winter storms threatened, these same children delivered baskets of preserved vegetables to elderly townsfolk. When spring floods washed out the lower bridge, they helped rebuild. The mountain, once a place of fear and superstition, became a sanctuary. The old ways, once practiced in secrecy, were reborn in daylight, not as rigid traditions but as living choices that evolved with each new child who found their way up the winding path to Mary's garden. The summer heat had scorched the valley for 3 months straight, when the first desperate faces appeared at the edge of Mary Johnson's garden. Children with hollow cheeks and adults with pride, worn thin as paper, They stood at the boundary where town ended and mountain began. Mary watched them from her porch, recognizing Pastor Robert Smith among them. The man who once called her a glutton now led the hungry with his head bowed. Beside him stood her mother, older now, her eyes unable to meet her daughter's gaze. "The wells are dry," the pastor announced, his voice cracking. "Nothing grows in the valley anymore." Mary nodded, feeling the mounting pulse beneath her feet. She had known they would come. The earth had whispered it to her as she worked among her thriving plants, tending the legacy Michael had surrendered to her. "We've come to ask," her mother began, then faltered. Mary stepped forward, her body strong and sure, moving with the confidence of someone who belonged exactly where she stood. The townspeople who once whispered the freight behind her back now looked at her with desperate hope. "I know why you've come," she said, her voice carrying across the gathering. "And I know what it cost you to be here." A child stepped forward, a little girl with tangled hair and fierce eyes. "My mama says you can make things grow even when there's no rain." Mary smiled and extended her hand to the child. "Your mama's right. What growing things takes more than magic. It takes work. It takes everyone's hand." She opened her garden gate wide, revealing rows of vegetables heavy with fruit, herbs fragrant in the dry air, and berries glistening like jewels. The sight drew gasps from the crowd. "The mountain provides," she explained, "but only to those who give back." Pastor Smith stepped forward. "What would you have us do?" Mary surveyed the faces before her. Neighbors who had shunned her, whispered about her, made her feel unwanted in her own skin. She could turn them away. The mountain would protect her regardless. Instead, she said, "Let's talk terms. The mountain needs caretakers, not just takers. Those who wish to eat must also plant, tend, and harvest. The children will learn the old ways from the women's circle. The men will help rebuild the stone markers that have fallen." She looked directly at her mother. "And no child will ever again be made to feel they are a burden." The townspeople murmured among themselves, weighing hunger against pride. One by one they nodded. Mary smiled, feeling the mountain's approval rumble deep beneath the soil. This was her legacy. Not bearing a son as Michael had once proclaimed, but bearing the future of Fern Ridge itself, rooted in her strength, her compassion, and the power she had claimed for herself.